Brandon Wilson sat quietly in seat 1A, a gentle pride glowing in his young chest. At just 15 years old, this was his very first time flying alone without the steady presence of his father, Christopher Wilson, by his side. Christopher, the well-known CEO of Orion Technologies, had personally booked the VIP seat for his Sona token of trust, encouragement, and a rite of passage into maturity. Brandon leaned back against the plush leather seat, feeling the softness beneath him, and gazed out the wide airplane window. The warm hues of the sunset stretched across the sky like a masterpiece, filling him with a sense of endless possibility. With a small, contented smile, Brandon accepted a glass of orange juice from a friendly flight attendant, savoring not just the drink, but the deeper meaning behind it. This was his father's way of telling him, "I believe in you." Little did Brandon know that this journey, which started with such peace, would soon become a test of his strength, dignity, and courage. The serenity of the cabin was soon disturbed by the sharp click of high heels. Approaching with heavy insistence, a woman draped in a tailored cream coat and wearing a meticulously styled appearance stopped near Brandon's seat. Patricia Lawson, a long-time Platinum Elite customer with a reputation for wielding her status like a weapon, scrutinized the boy sitting in 1A with thinly veiled disdain. Her eyes narrowed and her lips tightened into a frown as she assessed the situation with clear dissatisfaction. Without hesitation, she called for a flight attendant in a sharp, demanding voice, loud enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. "There must be some mistake," she announced to the cabin, her voice cutting through the air. "Why is a child sitting in seat 1A?" Her words weren't just a question. They were an accusation, a public spectacle meant to humiliate and assert dominance. The flight attendant, maintaining her professionalism, quickly checked the seating chart on her tablet and confirmed that seat 1A was indeed reserved for Brandon Wilson. Despite the clear evidence, Patricia refused to back down. She crossed her arms and lifted her chin defiantly, asserting her perceived superiority. "I am a Platinum Elite member," she declared, her voice dripping with entitlement. "I always sit in seat 1A. Always you need to move him immediately." The energy in the VIP cabin shifted from mild curiosity to an uncomfortable tension as the confrontation unfolded in full view of the other passengers. Brandon, feeling the weight of the many eyes now on him, tightened his grip on his glass of juice, but remembered his father's constant reminder. "When others lose their temper, you hold your ground with dignity." Taking a steady breath, Brandon turned to face Patricia. His voice, though soft, carried an unshakable resolve. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "but this seat was reserved for me by my father. I have no intention of moving." His simple yet powerful statement silenced the immediate area. For a moment, even Patricia seemed taken aback by the boy's composed response. She stared at him as if he were some anomaly she couldn't quite comprehend, a child who wasn't intimidated, who wasn't willing to bow to her demands simply because of her self-proclaimed importance. Around them, the whispers among the other passengers grew louder, some exchanging looks of discomfort, others of quiet admiration. Patricia, unwilling to concede, leaned in closer, her voice now lowered but filled with venom. "You should be grateful you're even sitting in this cabin," she hissed. "A child like you has no idea what true luxury means." Her words stung, not just because of their cruelty, but because of the arrogance they carried, the assumption that privilege could be wielded as a sword against innocence. Brandon felt a flash of heat on his cheeks, but steadied himself by recalling his father's lessons about true strength. "Respect yourself first," his father always said, "and others will learn to respect you too." Brandon looked her squarely in the eyes, his voice unwavering as he replied, "Mom, with all due respect, I am exactly where I belong." The standoff left the cabin in a heavy silence, a silence loaded with unspoken thoughts and shifting opinions. Patricia, now visibly trembling with anger, turned away abruptly, signaling a flight attendant with an imperious wave of her hand. It was clear she intended to escalate the matter even further, unaware that this confrontation would soon spiral beyond her control. Brandon, meanwhile, leaned back into his seat, not in defiance, but in quiet confidence. He understood now that this flight was no longer just a journey from one city to another. It had become a personal test, one that would measure not just his patience, but his ability to stand firm in the face of injustice. And Brandon Wilson, the boy who once looked out the airplane window dreaming of wide horizons, now found himself in the midst of a battle for dignity that would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The sharp, agitated voice of Patricia Lawson soon became impossible to ignore. Her complaints echoed through the VIP cabin, breaking the usual calmness expected in first-class travel. She paced a few steps in the aisle, loudly expressing her disbelief and outrage that she, a Platinum Elite customer, had been disrespected in such an unforgivable way. Every few seconds, she would turn toward Brandon Wilson, who remained seated in 1A, her glares heavy with unspoken accusations. The passengers seated nearby shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging glances filled with unease. Some whispered quietly among themselves, while others chose to look away, pretending not to notice the growing spectacle. Still, the atmosphere in the cabin thickened like a brewing storm, with Brandon sitting at its eye calm but alert, silently preparing himself for whatever would come next. As the tension in the air grew unbearable, a woman in a navy blue uniform stepped forward briskly from the front of the plane. Amanda Blake, the flight supervisor, approached the scene with the polished confidence of someone used to smoothing over passenger disputes. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat bun, and a silk scarf was tied crisply at her neck, giving her an air of authority. Patricia immediately seized upon Amanda's arrival, her voice rising even higher. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she cried out. "I always sit in 1A, and now you're letting some child take my seat." Amanda gave Patricia a tight, practiced smile, trying to maintain professionalism, and turned to check the flight manifest once more. After a brief moment, she confirmed that 1A was indeed reserved for Brandon Wilson. However, the hesitation in Amanda's eyes was unmistakable. A flicker of doubt, not in the facts, but in whether she should enforce them. Instead of standing firmly by the seating assignment, Amanda Blake attempted a more diplomatic approach, one that was in truth a subtle betrayal of fairness. Leaning down slightly toward Brandon, she spoke in a soft, coaxing tone that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of pressure. "Mr. Wilson Autry," she began, "I completely understand this is your assigned seat, but to avoid any further inconvenience for our valued guests, would you mind moving to another first-class seat? I assure you it would be just as comfortable." Her words were sugar-coated, wrapped in a veil of kindness, but the real meaning was clear. "Give up your seat so we can keep our elite customer happy." Brandon looked up at Amanda, sensing the deeper weight behind her request. Though framed politely, it wasn't a request rooted in fairness, it was an invitation to surrender his dignity for the sake of someone else's entitlement. Brandon took a breath, feeling the way the cabin's collective gaze seemed to rest heavily on him. His heart raced slightly under the weight of the moment, but he remembered what his father had always taught him about handling situations like this. "Respect yourself even when no one else does," his father once said. "Because in the end, your self-respect is the foundation of your strength." With those words anchoring him, Brandon lifted his head and looked Amanda Blake directly in the eyes. "Thank you, Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I would prefer to remain in the seat that was reserved for me. My father made this arrangement, and I don't see a reason to move." His response, polite yet unyielding, drew a subtle shift in the energy around him. Some passengers now watching with admiration rather than judgment. Amanda hesitated clearly, uncomfortable. Her role demanded that she avoid escalation, but Patricia's sharp, impatient breaths behind her were pressing like an invisible hand on her back. Patricia, sensing Amanda's uncertainty, stepped forward again with renewed aggression. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "Are you really going to let this nonsense delay the entire flight? What are we even paying for?" Her voice was laden with outrage, as if merely sharing an aisle with Brandon was a personal affront to her status. Yet even under the combined force of Patricia's entitlement and Amanda's polite coercion, Brandon remained seated, his hands resting steadily on his lap. He felt the storm raging around him, but like the strongest trees, he chose not to bend with the wind. Stay grounded, he told himself silently. Stay true. The confrontation, though still unresolved, left a lasting impression on everyone present. In a world where adults often use titles, wealth, and influence to tilt the scales of justice, Brandon's quiet defiance stood out like a beacon of integrity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply sat there rooted in the quiet confidence that he had done nothing wrong. Brandon Wilson, a 15-year-old boy traveling alone for the first time, had already proven something far greater than anyone could have expected, that true strength doesn't shout it. Stands calm and unmovable even when the whole world demands that it bow. The murmurs and side glances swirling around him felt heavier by the minute, as if invisible hands were pushing Brandon Wilson deeper into his seat. Despite the calm face he wore inside him, a swirl of emotions clashed: confusion, frustration, and a sharp sting of isolation. It wasn't just Patricia Lawson's piercing glares or the quiet whispers of judgment from other passengers that weighed on him. It was the subtle betrayal from the authority figures he thought would protect fairness. For a fleeting moment, Brandon wished his father were there, sitting beside him, like always offering a steady presence of assurance. His mind raced, but instinctively he knew he couldn't allow himself to be swallowed by doubt. Discreetly, without drawing further attention, Brandon slipped his phone from his jacket pocket and stood up. With slow, measured steps, he walked toward the back of the VIP cabin, where a dark blue curtain separated the premium class from the crew's service area. The flight attendant nearby glanced at him curiously, but recognizing the seriousness on his face, gave a silent nod, allowing Brandon a brief moment of privacy. Behind the thin curtain, Brandon's fingers trembled slightly as he found his father's contact and pressed call. Each ring sounded louder than the last in the enclosed space, echoing the pounding of his heart. Then finally, the familiar, steady voice answered, bringing with it a wave of calm that immediately soothed the turbulence inside him. "This is Dad, Brandon. Are you all right?" Christopher Wilson's voice, deep and unwavering, felt like a lifeline being thrown into a stormy sea. Brandon pressed the phone tightly to his ear, trying to hold back the emotion rising in his throat. "Dad, something's wrong," he said softly, careful to keep his voice from cracking. "There's a woman, Patricia Lawson. She says this seat doesn't belong to me. She's causing a big scene, and even the flight supervisor is pushing me to move. I don't know what to do." There was a brief pause on the line, but Brandon knew it wasn't hesitation. It was his father weighing the situation, already formulating a plan. Christopher's response came as steady and warm as ever, like a lighthouse cutting through a fog. "Listen to me, son," he said, his tone infused with calm authority. First of all, you did nothing wrong. That seat was reserved for you because you deserve it, and nobody has the right to take that away from you." His voice was a quiet anchor, pulling Brandon back from the swirling uncertainty. "I need you to stay calm. Sit tall. Say nothing more to them for now. I'll handle it from here, and I'll make sure they know exactly who they're dealing with." Brandon's shoulders, which had tensed involuntarily during the call, slowly began to relax. He didn't need to ask if his father would really intervene. He already knew Christopher Wilson had built a career not by shouting or bullying, but by being a man who moved mountains quietly and decisively when the situation demanded it. For a moment, Brandon hesitated, the lingering sense of guilt flickering across his heart. "Dad, are you sure I don't want to pull you away from anything important?" he said in a small voice. Across the line, Christopher chuckled, a low, reassuring sound that immediately lifted Brandon's spirits. "Son," he replied with gentle conviction, "there is no meeting or deal more important to me than you. Business can wait. Your dignity can't. Trust me. You're doing the right thing by standing your ground, and I'm proud of you for it." That simple statement, spoken without fanfare, planted an unshakable sense of strength deep within Brandon. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about knowing his worth and defending it, even when it would have been easier to surrender. Taking a deep breath, Brandon ended the call with a soft, "Thank you, Dad," It'll stay strong. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, he stood for a moment behind the curtain, gathering himself. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders, and felt a new steadiness flow through him. Not the bravado of anger, but the quiet power of self-respect. As he pushed the curtain aside and stepped back into the bright, watching eyes of the VIP cabin, the air seemed to shift subtly around him. Patricia, still perched in the aisle like a self-appointed queen awaiting surrender, caught sight of him and narrowed her eyes in suspicion. Yet Brandon said nothing. He simply walked back to seat. A sat down gracefully and folded his hands neatly in his lap. His expression composed his resolve unshakable. The passengers around him sensed the difference immediately. There was something in the way Brandon carried himself now, an invisible shield that no sneer or sarcastic remark could penetrate. Patricia, frustrated by the lack of submission, huffed dramatically and turned away, unaware that far above the clouds, forces were already moving swiftly in Brandon's defense. Brandon leaned back against the seat, his gaze once again settling on the window. The sky beyond was still vast and open, stretching infinitely beyond the sunset. And within Brandon's chest, a newfound resilience had begun to take root, own that would not just carry him through this flight, but through all the battles that lay ahead in his life. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the calm, unwavering dignity his father had taught him. And in that moment, Brandon Wilson wasn't just a boy on his first solo flight anymore. He was a young man standing tall in the face of injustice, knowing exactly who he was. Christopher Wilson ended the call with Brandon, his hand resting briefly on the polished surface of the conference table. For a moment, the CEO of Orion Technologies sat still, his mind racing faster than the dozens of executives seated around him. They were mid-discussion about a multi-billion-dollar merger, one of the most critical business moves of the year, but Christopher's focus had shifted entirely. Without hesitation, he stood up his tailored suit, brushing against the leather chair, and gave a simple nod to his stunned team. "We'll continue this later," he said, his voice firm but not rushed. No one dared question him. Everyone in that room understood. When Christopher Wilson prioritized something over business, it wasn't trivial. His calm but commanding demeanor made it clear this was a matter beyond contracts and profits. Without further explanation, he exited the boardroom, phone in hand, walking with determined strides toward his private office. Inside the quiet of his office, Christopher closed the door behind him and immediately dialed the direct line to the airline's senior management office, a number few people even had access to. As the phone rang, he glanced briefly out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, his mind razor-sharp and unwavering. On the third ring, a voice answered the tone immediately respectful. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. It's an honor to hear from you. How can I assist you today?" Christopher wasted no time on pleasantries. His voice, though controlled, carried an unmistakable edge. "My son is currently on one of your flights. He's being harassed by another passenger and pressured by your crew to give up his assigned seat." He said each word deliberate, heavy with meaning. "I want this issue resolved, immediately and properly, or I assure you the consequences for your airline's reputation will be swift and severe." The man on the other end of the line, a senior vice president well-versed in high-profile crisis management, straightened in his chair, instinctively sensing the gravity in Christopher's tone. "Mr. Wilson," he replied, his voice a touch shaky, despite years of experience, "I deeply apologize for any inconvenience your son is experiencing. May I ask for more specific details, so we can act on this right away?" Christopher's response was cool and direct. "The passenger causing the issue is named Patricia Lawson, a Platinum Elite member. She is attempting to displace my son Brandon Wilson from seat 1A, which was properly reserved for him. More concerning is that your flight supervisor appears to be complicit in this harassment rather than protecting my son's rights as a paying customer." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "If this isn't handled with the utmost seriousness, I won't hesitate to bring this matter to national attention." There was a tense silence on the line, filled only by the faint hum of air conditioning. The senior executive on the other end realized this was not a situation they could afford to mishandle. Christopher Wilson wasn't just another wealthy customer. He was a titan of industry, a man whose words carried weight far beyond his company walls. "Mr. Wilson," the executive finally replied, his tone now firm with urgency. "We are deeply sorry for this unacceptable experience. I will personally oversee the intervention. I am contacting the captain and our top in-flight supervisors immediately. You have my word, we will address this respectfully and swiftly." Christopher listened, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond with gratitude or relief. He expected this level of seriousness. Anything less would have been an insult to his sons, dignity, and to the values he built his empire upon. Hanging up the phone, Christopher allowed himself a moment to exhale slowly. He didn't enjoy using his influence this way. He was a man who believed in building things, not tearing them down. But when it came to protecting his son, there was no hesitation. Brandon needed to know that standing up for oneself was never in vain, even when facing down institutions larger and older than oneself. Christopher turned from the window and sat down at his desk, his mind still sharply attuned to the situation unfolding at 40,000 feet above ground. He trusted that the people now tasked with handling it would understand what was at stake, but even if they didn't, they was ready to take this fight as far as necessary. For him, it wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about teaching his son, and everyone watching, that fairness wasn't a privilege, it was a right. Meanwhile, up in the skies, the shift in energy had already begun. Brandon, seated calmly once more in 1A, could feel something intangible but powerful moving in his favor. He didn't know the exact actions his father was taking, but deep down he knew Christopher Wilson never made empty promises. Justice was already on its way, and no amount of arrogance, entitlement, or corporate hesitancy could stand in its path. Brandon tightened his seatbelt with steady hands, his heart lighter than before. He wasn't alone in this fight. His father had lit a fire behind the scenes, and soon those who had doubted or disrespected him would realize they had underestimated not just a boy traveling alone, but a young man backed by unwavering love principle and the quiet might of a father who refused to let injustice stand. Just as the tension in the VIP cabin threatened to choke every breath out of the air, the soft hiss of the main cabin door opening interrupted the building storm. Heads turned instantly, passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Into the cabin stepped two sharply dressed men, their polished shoes making little sound on the carpeted floor, but their presence cutting through the room like a cold blade. Robert Jennings, the senior vice president of passenger relations, led the way with a face carved from stone, expressionless yet commanding. Behind him followed Matthew Carter, director of customer integrity, whose sharp, attentive gaze missed nothing. Their dark suits, neatly pressed shirts, and clipped name badges left no doubt these men were not regular crew members. They had boarded the plane mid-flight under extraordinary circumstances, and everyone, including the rattled flight attendants and the stubborn Patricia Lawson, understood immediately that something serious was about to unfold. Without pausing for pleasantries, Robert Jennings moved down the aisle with an air of quiet authority, his sharp eyes sweeping over the cabin like a seasoned investigator. Matthew followed closely behind, already pulling up details on a slim digital tablet. They stopped near the VIP section, where the heart of the disturbance, Brandon Wilson, seated calmly in 1A, and Patricia Lawson, bristling with barely contained fury, awaited Robert's voice, cool and precise, broke the charged silence. "We are here to address a reported issue involving seating assignments and customer treatment," he said, his tone making it clear that no further drama would be tolerated. He turned to Amanda Blake, the flight supervisor, and asked in a voice that left no room for evasion, "Please explain exactly how this situation unfolded from the beginning." Amanda visibly paled under his gaze, glancing nervously at Patricia as if seeking a silent ally, but realizing too late that her fate was no longer in Patricia's hands. Amanda stumbled through her explanation, trying to paint her decision as a quick solution meant to avoid escalation. She admitted that Patricia had demanded seat 1A and that she had politely suggested Brandon move to avoid inconveniencing an important customer. Robert Jennings listened without expression, though the tightening of his jaw betrayed his growing disapproval. When Amanda finished, Matthew Carter stepped forward, verifying Brandon's ticket and reservation on his tablet with a few taps. He looked up, his voice clear and factual. "Brandon Wilson is the rightful occupant of seat 1A. His reservation was made weeks in advance through verified channels. There is no record of any seat reassignment. Patricia Lawson's claims have no legal or contractual basis." A heavy silence fell across the VIP cabin. Patricia's face flushed crimson, while Amanda and Greg Foster, the attendant who had remained complicitly silent, exchanged anxious, desperate glances. Robert Jennings turned back to Amanda and Greg, his expression now hard as steel. "In light of your mishandling of this situation, including the failure to protect a customer's rights and the undue pressure placed on a minor traveling alone, we are suspending you both from duty, effective immediately," he said. His words landed like hammer blows in the cabin. Amanda's mouth opened as if to protest, but the chilling finality in Robert's tone warned her it would be useless. Greg Foster looked stricken, the color draining from his face as he realized the gravity of their actions. Around them, the passengers watched with a mixture of satisfaction, disbelief, and discomfort, the air heavy with the weight of consequences finally being delivered. Amanda's shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of her suspension. She looked down, avoiding the eyes of both passengers and crew, shame coloring her usually confident features. Greg stood rigidly at her side, clutching the handles of the service cart as if it could somehow anchor him against the tide of judgment crashing down upon him. Robert Jennings didn't linger on their disgrace. He turned instead to Brandon, his voice softening slightly but retaining its firmness. "Mr. Wilson, on behalf of the airline, I extend our sincerest apologies. You should never have been subjected to this treatment." Brandon met Robert's gaze steadily, nodding once in acknowledgement, his calm demeanor undisturbed. Even amid the chaos, he carried himself not as a frightened teenager, but as someone who understood exactly what it meant to defend dignity without raising a voice. As Robert Jennings and Matthew Carter moved to formally report their findings to the captain, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. Justice long overdue had finally found its footing at 40,000 feet. Patricia Lawson stood rooted to the spot, her power stripped away, not by shouting or force, but by the silent, irrefutable truth of accountability. Amanda and Greg prepared to step aside, awaiting formal instructions to leave the flight, and Brandon, the boy, who had sat silently through insults, pressure, and public humiliation, remained seated in 1A, unmoved and unbroken. In that moment, it became clear to everyone present that real strength wasn't about title or status. It was about standing firm when standing alone, knowing that what is right must never be surrendered to what is convenient. Patricia Lawson stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process what had just unfolded before her. She had always believed her platinum elite status granted her immunity from inconvenience, but today her carefully constructed aura of entitlement had been cracked, and the humiliation was more than she could bear. Her chest heaving with fury, she refused to accept the reality that two of the airline's own senior executives had ruled against her. With the stinging wound of her lost power fresh and burning, Patricia clenched her fist at her sides and demanded in a voice that shook with anger, "I want to speak to the captain right now." Heads turned again in the cabin, the other passengers collectively holding their breath. Patricia, oblivious to the weary glares and murmurs around her, pushed forward, raising her voice even louder. "This is an outrage. I will sue this airline. I will contact every major media outlet and expose this injustice," she barked, throwing threats like darts in every direction. The flight attendants exchanged anxious glances, unsure of how to proceed without worsening the situation. Robert Jennings, maintaining his calm professionalism, nodded once toward the front of the plane. Moments later, the door to the cockpit opened, and a man with a commanding presence stepped into the cabin. Captain Thomas Mitchell, with his broad shoulders and neatly pressed uniform, exuded the kind of quiet authority that immediately calmed even the most restless flights. His silver hair, sharp eyes, and composed expression left no doubt that he was a man who had weathered countless storms in the air and on the ground. Captain Mitchell walked slowly toward the VIP section, his gaze coolly assessing the tension hanging over the cabin. Patricia, seeing him approach, squared her shoulders and lifted her chin defiantly, ready to unleash a fresh wave of outrage. Yet when the captain stopped in front of her, and Brandon, the weight of his presence alone, seemed to dim the room's chaos for just a moment. With remarkable patience, Captain Mitchell turned first to Patricia, signaling with an open hand for her to explain. Wasting no time, Patricia launched into a tirade about loyalty, customer rights, and the countless thousands she had spent with the airline over the years. Her voice rose and fell with theatrical passion, drawing looks of irritation from nearby passengers. She painted herself as the victim, describing Brandon's presence in seat 1A as an unforgivable insult to her long-standing loyalty. Captain Mitchell listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask of professionalism. When Patricia finally paused, panting slightly from her own indignation, the captain shifted his gaze to Robert Jennings, who nodded in confirmation that the matter had been fully reviewed. Without raising his voice, without changing the calm cadence of his speech, Captain Mitchell addressed the situation with a quiet but unbreakable firmness that left no room for doubt as Lawson! He began, his voice carrying across the cabin with quiet authority. While we deeply value all our loyal customers, your membership status does not supersede another passenger's legal right to occupy their properly assigned seat. He paused just long enough to let the truth settle like a stone in still water. Seat 1A was lawfully reserved by Mr. Brandon Wilson. There has been no error, there is no ambiguity. He has every right to remain in his seat for the duration of this flight. Patricia opened her mouth as if to argue again, but Captain Mitchell lifted a hand, his expression firm. Further disruption of this flight will not be tolerated, he said, his tone sharpening. If you continue to disturb the crew, the passengers, or attempt to contest this matter, again, I will have no choice but to remove you from this aircraft. His words were measured and respectful, but the warning within them was unmistakably real. The cabin seemed to shrink around Patricia as the finality of the captain's statement settled in. The passengers, who had grown tired of the spectacle, sat rigidly in their seats, watching to see whether she would push her luck further. Patricia's face turned a shade darker, her mouth twitching between outrage and disbelief. Never before had she been spoken to this way by someone in authority. Never had her demands been so flatly denied. She glanced around the cabin, seeking sympathy or validation, but found only weary faces and disapproving eyes. Even the flight attendants she once barked orders at now stood with expressions of cautious distance, unwilling to be drawn back into her orbit of chaos. For the first time in a long time, Patricia Lawson felt truly alone, stripped of the invisible armor her privilege usually provided, and yet her pride refused to let her back down without a fight. With a sharp intake of breath, Patricia turned back toward Captain Mitchell, her voice lower but no less venomous. "You're making a terrible mistake," she hissed through gritted teeth. "This will not end here." The captain regarded her for a long, quiet moment, then simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a passing storm cloud. He made no further threats, no grand pronouncements. His point had been made, and the decision was final. With that, Captain Mitchell turned to return to the cockpit, his posture unshaken, his authority reinforced not through aggression, but through unwavering resolve. Behind him, Patricia stood trembling, not just with anger, but with the slow dawning realization that there would be no rescue this time, no special privileges, no whispered apologies, no salvaged dignity. Brandon Wilson, meanwhile, sat quietly in seat 1A, his gaze steady, his spirit undefeated, having weathered the storm with the kind of quiet strength that even adults twice his age might have struggled to summon. The cabin settled into a heavy silence after Captain Thomas Mitchell's stern final warning, but Patricia Lawson was far from ready to accept defeat. Her pride, wounded and bleeding, pushed her into reckless defiance. With a dramatic huff, she stepped into the center aisle, her voice rising sharply enough to slice through the weary quiet of the VIP section. This is pure discrimination, she shouted, her hands flailing as she pointed angrily toward Brandon Wilson and the crew. I have spent tens of thousands of dollars flying with this airline, and this is how you treat loyal customers, favoring a child over someone who has earned the right to be respected. Her voice trembled with rage, but the passengers' faces around her showed no sympathy, only impatience and fatigue. Patricia seemed oblivious to their growing disdain as she pushed forward louder and more desperate. This injustice will not stand. You'll all regret the way you've treated me today, she bellowed, practically daring someone to challenge her. Robert Jennings, who had remained standing discreetly to the side, now stepped forward once again, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall. He carried with him an authority that needed no theatrics, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures. When he spoke, his words were like iron bars locking into place. Mrs. Lawson, he said, his tone low, but commanding enough to still the remaining murmurs among the passengers due to your repeated disruptive behavior, verbal harassment of other passengers and crew, and violation of airline policies regarding passenger conduct. We are officially revoking your Platinum Elite membership status effective immediately. The announcement hit the cabin like a lightning bolt. Even the passengers, who had grown exhausted by the drama, turned wide-eyed toward Patricia, their expressions reflecting shock, disbelief, and in some cases quiet satisfaction. It was a move rarely seen at 40,000 feet, a public stripping away of privilege once wielded like a shield. For a moment, Patricia stood frozen, as if Robert's words had sucked the oxygen from her lungs. Then, like a volcano forced beyond its breaking point, she erupted. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her outrage. "I have friends in the media. He'll have your airline blasted across every news outlet in the country. He'll sue you for defamation, for discrimination, for emotional distress." Her voice spiraled higher, shriller, more unhinged with every passing second. Passengers shrank away from her, some openly covering their ears, others simply exchanging looks of discomfort. But Robert Jennings stood firm, unmoved by the increasingly desperate threats. He had seen this pattern before. Those used to getting their way often responded to accountability with rage. Still, no matter how loudly Patricia raged, the foundation she stood on had already crumbled. No threats could rebuild it. Matthew Carter, who had quietly taken his place beside Robert, stepped forward slightly, reinforcing the decision with a calm, concise statement. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice level, but impenetrably firm. "Your behavior today has not only violated our company's passenger conduct policies, but has also endangered the dignity and comfort of everyone aboard this flight. No membership status, no amount of money grants the right to mistreat others or disrupt operations. Our decision is final. We advise you to comply with further instructions immediately." Matthew's words didn't rise above a professional tone, yet they slammed shut the door. Patricia kept trying to force open. She stood there, seething, her hands clenching and unclenching by her sides, her once proud posture now wilted under the invisible weight of accountability she had never before been forced to carry. Realizing she had lost her audience, Patricia turned again to the other passengers, her voice desperate, pleading. "Is everyone here really okay with this?" she cried out. "Are you going to stand by and watch me be humiliated?" But the passengers remained silent, their faces hard and closed. Some looked away deliberately. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Even those who had initially watched with some curiosity now wished only for the drama to end so the flight could proceed in peace. The realization hit Patricia harder than any official announcement she was truly alone. No platinum card, no loyalty points, no public tantrum would rescue her from the consequences of her own actions this time. Her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat as she backed away, slightly defeated yet still clinging stubbornly to her outrage. Robert Jennings gave a quiet nod to the flight attendant standing at the ready, signaling the next steps. Brandon Wilson, still seated in 1A, watched the unfolding scene, not with triumph, but with a calm sadness. It wasn't victory he felt. It was a deeper understanding of human nature, the realization that entitlement, when left unchecked, could rot even the strongest reputations from within his father's. Teachings echoed gently in his mind. The true measure of a person's character isn't revealed in their success. It's revealed in how they respond when they're told no. As the flight prepared to move forward, and the final chapters of this ordeal loomed, Brandon sat, tall, silent, dignified. Meanwhile, Patricia Lawson, who had started the flight, believing herself untouchable, now stood stripped of status, stripped of support, and stripped of the illusion that her power could bend justice to her will. Patricia Lawson stood trembling in the aisle, her breathing shallow, her face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and rage. Her mind, once so sure of its privilege and influence, now scrambled desperately for a foothold that no longer existed. As her voice continued to rise in sharp, frantic bursts of protest, Captain Thomas Mitchell, observing the growing disturbance from the front of the VIP cabin, knew the line had been crossed beyond redemption. Without a word, he gave a discreet signal to the crew stationed near the service doors. Moments later, the cabin door opened once more, and two security officers dressed in crisp navy uniforms with solemn faces stepped aboard. Their presence alone sent a silent ripple through the passengers. These were not men who would negotiate or debate. They had been summoned to restore order, and their mandate was clear. The disruption had to end, and it had to end now. The officers moved with steady, purposeful steps down the aisle, their eyes locked firmly on Patricia. She noticed them immediately, and her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in defiance. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, taking a step backward as if physical distance could somehow shield her from accountability. The security officers approached with professional calmness, their hands open and non-threatening but firm in their resolve. "Ma'am," one officer said, his voice low but carrying unmistakable authority, "due to your repeated disruptions and refusal to comply with the captain's instructions, you are being removed from this flight. Please collect your belongings and come with us now." Patricia's hands balled into fists, her body trembling as she unleashed another torrent of angry words. She accused the airline of ageism, racism, sexism, grasping wildly at any justification that might reverse her crumbling situation. But the officers did not flinch. They simply stood their ground, waiting for her compliance. Instead of cooperating, Patricia escalated further, her voice climbing into a high-pitched screech that echoed painfully through the enclosed cabin. "I will sue every single one of you. You'll all lose your jobs for this. It'll ruin this airline." She screamed her words, losing coherence as her panic and fury merged into a blur of outrage. Some passengers turned away, embarrassed by the scene. Others watched openly, their expressions hard and unsympathetic. A few even began to murmur among themselves, quietly urging the officers to hurry and remove her so the flight could finally resume. Patricia, seeing the lack of support around her, seemed to realize with dawning horror that no one, absolutely no one, was on her side. Her voice faltered for a moment, but her pride, still unwilling to concede, fueled one last desperate act. She clutched the back of a nearby seat and refused to move, her knuckles white against the leather, daring the officers to try and pull her away. Seeing that verbal persuasion would no longer work, the officers exchanged a brief glance and nodded. Moving in with practiced precision, they gently but firmly unwrapped Patricia's fingers from the seat and took hold of her arms. She struggled, briefly writhing and kicking, her shrieks of protest growing weaker as the inevitability of her removal became undeniable. With professional efficiency, the officers escorted her down the aisle toward the exit, their grip steady but never cruel. As she passed each row, Patricia's wild eyes darted from face to face, searching one last time for an ally. A sympathetic look, anything, but the passengers met her gaze with a mixture of exhaustion, irritation, and silent judgment. She had pushed too far for too long, and now there was no rescue, no redemption. Her removal was not just a procedural act, it was the final public dismantling of the false power she had wielded so recklessly. As the cabin door closed behind Patricia and the security officers, a profound silence settled over the VIP section, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for confirmation that the chaos had truly ended. Then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to lift. Shoulders relaxed, passengers leaned back into their seats. Small, relieved conversations began to ripple quietly through the rows. Some exchanged nods of understanding. Others simply smiled softly, grateful that the ordeal was over. It wasn't just the end of a disruptive passengers tirade. It was a reaffirmation that fairness and order could prevail even against the loudest voices of entitlement. In seat 1A, Brandon Wilson sat quietly gazing once more out the window at the endless stretch of sky beyond. He hadn't needed to shout, to threaten, or to fight with rage. He had endured with dignity, and the outcome spoke for itself. Justice, when patient and principled, would always find its way. The cabin, once heavy with tension, now breathed a quiet, collective sigh of relief. As the plane settled into a calm hum once again, Brandon Wilson remained seated in 1A, his posture steady, his face composed. He did not fidget nervously, nor did he display any outward sign of triumph. He simply sat quietly gazing out the window, his expression thoughtful and serene. While others around him whispered about the dramatic events that had just unfolded, Brandon exuded a calm so profound it seemed almost to fill the space around him with invisible strength. He had endured the public pressure, the insults, the mounting aggression without ever raising his voice or abandoning his dignity. And now, though the cabin returned to normal, an unspoken respect for him began to grow, passing silently from passenger to passenger like a ripple across still water. As the flight attendants resumed their duties and the service carts rolled softly through the aisles, a woman seated a few rows behind Brandon rose from her seat and made her way forward. She was in her mid-50s, dressed simply in a navy cardigan and dark jeans, with kind eyes that had observed every detail of the earlier confrontation. She paused beside Brandon's seat, waiting until she caught his eye before speaking. Her voice was low but firm, carrying a weight of sincerity that the boy instantly recognized. "Young man," she said, offering him a gentle smile, "I just wanted to tell you, what you did today took real courage. Not many adults, let alone someone your age, would have handled that situation with such grace and strength." She placed a hand briefly on the headrest of his seat, a gesture of genuine respect. "You have every reason to be proud of yourself." Brandon, surprised but touched by her words, smiled back, the warmth of her praise sinking into him like sunlight after a long storm. The woman's small act of kindness seemed to spark a quiet chain reaction. A man across the aisle gave Brandon a thumbs up. Another passenger, an elderly gentleman near the window, tipped his head in silent approval. Even some of the flight attendants, now more relaxed, offered Brandon small smiles as they passed. No grand applause erupted, no standing ovations filled the air, but somehow the absence of fanfare made the acknowledgement even more powerful. Brandon had not fought for attention or applause. He had fought quietly and steadily for something far greater, his right to be treated with fairness and respect, and now, without a single boastful word from his mouth, he had earned something rare and invaluable: the genuine admiration of those who had witnessed his quiet stand. Brandon leaned back against his seat, feeling an unusual but welcome sensation filling his chest. It wasn't arrogance or smugness. It was pride, pure and simple. But it wasn't the pride that came from winning a contest or outsmarting an opponent. It was the deeper, steadier pride of knowing he had stayed true to himself, even when the easier path had been to give in. As he sat there, he thought of his father, Christopher Wilson, of the countless lessons spoken over family dinners, the quiet conversations late at night, when Brandon faced schoolyard challenges or moments of self-doubt. "Strength isn't always loud," his father would say. "Sometimes real strength is just standing your ground without losing your kindness." Today, Brandon had finally understood what those words meant, not in theory, but in lived experience. Looking once more out the airplane window, Brandon saw the sky stretching endlessly beyond the wing, a brilliant canvas of deep blue and scattered clouds. The sun was setting now, casting long golden streaks across the horizon. He allowed himself a small, contented smile, knowing that this flight, what was supposed to be a simple solo journey, had turned into a far more important milestone. He hadn't just traveled from one city to another, he had crossed a far greater distance inside himself, stepping from boyhood into a deeper understanding of who he was and who he wanted to be. Whatever lay ahead, challenges, opportunities, moments of doubt, he knew now that he carried something within him, that no one could take away the unshakable foundation of dignity and quiet courage. And as the engines roared softly, propelling the aircraft forward through the darkening sky, Brandon sat with a heart full of gratitude and a spirit strengthened by trial. He didn't need trophies or headlines to mark what he had achieved today. The most important victories were often the ones unseen by the world, measured not in applause, but in the quiet, unbreakable knowledge that he had honored the best parts of himself. Somewhere far below the city lights began to twinkle like stars scattered across the earth, and Brandon Wilson, just 15 years old, but carrying the weight and wisdom of much more, closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peace of a hard-fought, quietly won victory wash over him. Several weeks after the turbulent flight that had tested not just patience but principles, the story of what transpired aboard that plane continued to ripple quietly through conversations, boardrooms, and corporate offices. Brandon Wilson, however, had moved forward with life, returning to school, participating in soccer practice, and laughing with friends who had no idea how close he had come to being a catalyst for something much larger. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Thursday afternoon, a press release from the airline swept across national news outlets, online platforms, and social media. The headline was simple yet powerful: Airline issues, public apology, commits to major diversity and inclusion reforms. The statement that followed was even more remarkable. In carefully chosen words, the airline acknowledged the failure that had occurred, not just in the handling of one young passenger's rights, but in the deeper systems that allowed such a failure to happen in the first place. They promised sweeping reforms, from revising employee training programs to strengthening anti-discrimination policies across all levels of operation. Christopher Wilson sat in his office, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow across his mahogany desk as he read the statement carefully. A rare, quiet smile touched his lips. He was not a man easily impressed by corporate apologies, having seen too many crafted purely for optics rather than real accountability. But this one felt different. The airline had not only admitted its mistake, but had laid out clear, measurable steps it would take to ensure future passengers would not face what Brandon had endured. Christopher leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting momentarily to that tense moment when he had left a room full of executives to take his son's calm, instinctive choice that now felt more profound than ever. Picking up his phone, Christopher issued a simple public statement of his own, praising the airline for taking responsibility and committing to real change. "It is never weakness to admit mistakes," he wrote. "It is strength. True leadership means learning, changing, and ensuring that dignity and fairness are protected for all." Brandon found out about the airline's announcement later that evening. His father had left a printed copy of the statement on the kitchen counter, right next to a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies, a small familiar gesture of comfort that only Christopher Wilson would think to offer. On a day like this, Brandon sat down, reading the words, slowly absorbing their meaning. With each paragraph, a quiet warmth spread through him, not the flash of self-congratulation, but the deeper satisfaction that he had helped ignite something positive. It would have been easy to remain silent that day, to give in to the pressure and walk away, telling himself it was worth the fight, but because he had chosen to hold his ground with dignity, a company serving millions of passengers had been pushed to reflect, to grow, and to promise a better future. Brandon realized then that real change didn't always happen through grand speeches or heroic battles. Sometimes it began with a quiet no, spoken at the right moment for the right reasons. Later that night, as the house settled into the comfortable stillness of evening, Brandon sat by his bedroom window, gazing out at the stars scattered across the sky. He thought about all the unseen ways that small actions could ripple outward, how a boy refusing to surrender his seat could lead to thousands of employees learning new ways to protect dignity and respect, how passengers who once might have stayed silent would now feel empowered to speak up when they witnessed unfairness. Brandon didn't imagine his name would be etched into any history books or that the world would remember his part in this change. But that was never the point. The reward was far greater and much more personal, the knowledge that he had stayed true to the values his father had taught him. Values like fairness, courage, patience, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing was never in vain, no matter how small the stage or how silent the applause. Meanwhile, across the country and even internationally, the airline's announcement spurred conversations among other corporations, civic leaders, and everyday citizens. It became a quiet but powerful case study in the importance of accountability and reform. In leadership seminars, news articles, and diversity workshops, the story was shared, not always naming Brandon, but always honoring the principle he had embodied that the right to fairness and respect was not something earned by status or wealth, but something every person deserved inherently. Christopher Wilson received private messages from other executives thanking him for standing by his son so publicly and gracefully. Parents he had never met wrote letters to him, sharing how they had used the story as a lesson for their own children. And yet, in their own home, neither Christopher nor Brandon spoke much about the media coverage. Their bond had never needed public validation. They simply knew without needing to say it that together they had proven something deeply important about who they were and about the kind of world they hoped to shape. As the days turned into weeks and life resumed its ordinary rhythms, Brandon carried the lessons of that experience quietly within him. He didn't feel the need to talk about it often. He didn't see himself as a hero. Instead, he simply walked a little taller, met people's eyes a little more steadily, and listened a little more carefully when others spoke of fairness, respect, and courage. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, that change wasn't some distant, abstract ideal. It was a living thing, built moment by moment, choice by choice in small acts of integrity that, when woven together, could change the course of lives, businesses, even societies. And though he knew there would be harder battles ahead, Brandon Wilson felt ready to face them, not with anger or arrogance, but with the same quiet, unshakable strength that had carried him through a long flight, a public storm, and into a deeper, richer understanding of what it truly meant to stand up for what was right. As time gently moved forward, Brandon Wilson's experience on that unforgettable flight became more than just a personal memory. It became a quiet but powerful lesson that lived within him. In the days that followed, as the world around him returned to its everyday rhythm, Brandon often found himself reflecting not on the conflict, not on the anger or humiliation he had faced, but on what had truly been at stake. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stand firm even when fear whispered in your ear, even when surrender would have been easier. Justice was not something granted by status or circumstance. It was something fought for, protected, sometimes even demanded in the most uncomfortable of ways. And self-respect, that silent companion that held his head high when everything else tried to tear him down, was the greatest victory of all. Brandon understood now that life would present many such moments, some larger, some smaller, but the choice would always remain the same: to yield to pressure or to stand tall in the face of it. Outside of Brandon's own circle, the story of the young boy who defended his seat with grace and dignity spread slowly, then steadily becoming a symbol in unexpected places. Business seminars cited it as an example of how corporate policies must align with moral responsibility. Schools discussed it in ethics classes, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and courage. Parents told their children about Brandon Wilson, the boy who refused to let arrogance and status intimidate him, teaching them that true strength wasn't in wealth or loud voices, but in steadfastness and self-belief. In a world often obsessed with glamour, fame, and privilege, Brandon's story stood quietly as a reminder that truth and fairness were forces more enduring than any title or social standing. Power could be bought and privilege could be inherited, but respect, the kind that mattered, could only ever be earned. Brandon himself never sought to become a symbol. He didn't wear his experience like a medal, nor did he chase recognition. Instead, he carried the lessons deep within him, quietly shaping his future interactions, decisions, and dreams. He began to see how easily people were judged by appearances, by status, by assumptions, and how important it was to look deeper, to listen, longer, to advocate gently but firmly for what was right. Whether standing up for a quiet friend on the schoolyard, speaking out against unfair treatment at a team practice, or simply offering kindness to someone overlooked, Brandon applied the same quiet strength he had shown on that flight. Through these everyday actions, he proved that lasting change didn't always come from grand revolutions. Sometimes it came from a boy who simply refused to move from his rightful place, who sat quietly firmly until the world around him remembered what fairness looked like. And although Brandon's name was rarely mentioned in the media after the initial flurry of attention, the impact of his actions continued to ripple outward. Airline policies shifted, flight crews received better training. A dozen other companies re-evaluated their customer service models, realizing that true loyalty wasn't about catering to status, it was about honoring every individual equally. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people, passengers, workers, students, began to believe a little more strongly that their voice mattered, that it wasn't necessary to be the loudest or the richest or the most famous to make a difference, that sometimes it was the quiet, steady refusal to accept injustice that created the first crack in a wall of indifference. Through his experience, Brandon had illuminated a path not just for himself, but for countless others who might one day find themselves in similar storms. Late one evening, as Brandon sat by the window in his room, a cool breeze drifting in from the open pane, he reflected on the journey he had taken, both in the air and within himself. He thought about the moments he had felt small, overwhelmed, tempted to give in. He thought about the weight of standing alone, about the eyes that had judged him, and about the eyes that had quietly admired him. Most of all, he thought about the quiet pride he now carried, a pride rooted not in victory over another person, but in victory over fear, over doubt, over injustice. Looking out at the wide, starlit sky, Brandon smiled softly, knowing that this was just the beginning. Life would offer many more moments of choice, moments when standing tall would not be easy, but he was ready. He knew now that the smallest voice, when guided by truth and strength, could echo farther than anyone could imagine. And so the boy who once sat alone in seat 1A became a quiet symbol not of rebellion, but of resilience, not of anger, but of courage, not of victory over others, but of victory over injustice itself. Brandon Wilson had shown that it is not our titles, our wealth, or our privileges that define us. It is our choices, the small, steady, courageous ones that carve the deepest marks into the world. His journey was not just a story of one flight or one confrontation. It was a lasting reminder that every single person, no matter how young or how ordinary, holds within them the power to stand for what is right, to spark change where change is needed, and to inspire others simply by refusing to sit down when dignity demands that we remain standing. If this story touched you and reminded you of the importance of courage, fairness, and quiet strength, we invite you to become part of the Deep Inside HQ community. Here we share real, thought-provoking stories that celebrate resilience, honor, integrity, and inspire positive change. Don't miss out on more journeys that reveal the true power of human spirit. Hit the subscribe button, like the video, and share it with others who believe in standing up for what's right. Together, let's keep the light of justice and compassion shining brightly for everyone.